We've been walking together through a story that began long before Bethlehem, right? A story that began in the garden, continued in the wilderness, and now speaks through the prophets. This series that we're in, Heaven Came Down, is about a God who refuses to stay distant. A God who has always longed to dwell with his people. A God who came not to visit, but to remain. In Sermon 1, we stood in the garden and listened for the sound of footsteps in the cool of the day, God walking with Adam and Eve. We heard his heart-breaking question, "Where are you?" And we learned that even when humanity hid, God sought. He didn't abandon us to our brokenness. He began his pursuit of restoration. Then in Sermon 2, we journeyed into the wilderness. We stood at the door of the tabernacle and watched the glory of God fill the tent. We entered Solomon's temple and saw the cloud descend once more. And we discovered that God's presence moves with his people. He's not stationary. He's steadfast. He's not confined to a place. He's committed to his people. And now in Sermon 3, we arrive at the next moment in this divine melody. God in the prophets. The promise of Emmanuel. Because after the temple came the tragedy. After the glory came exile. After fellowship came silence. The people who once saw the glory of God filling their temple wept now by the rivers of Babylon, asking, "How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" It seemed as though heaven had gone quiet. The footsteps of God had faded into memory. The cloud had lifted. The fire had gone out. And yet right there in the shadows of silence, God began to whisper again through prophets. Through promises, through the echo of Emmanuel. Let's open our Bibles to Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Immanuel." That word, Immanuel, means God with us. Not God above us, not God beyond us, not even God around us, but God with us. And church, that word changed everything. Now, before we rush to Bethlehem, though, let's sit with Isaiah for a moment. Because when he wrote those words, Israel wasn't celebrating, they were struggling. They weren't in triumph, they were in turmoil. Their king Ahaz was terrified. The nation was under threat from powerful enemies, and fear had become their national anthem. And it's into that fear that God sends a word, a promise through his prophet. A child will be born. A son will be given. And through that child, God himself will dwell with his people again. Sometimes the greatest promises of God come during the darkest moments of life. It's when you feel like you're in exile, when the temple feels empty, when the silence of heaven weighs heavy, that God whispers a word of hope. I'm still with you. That's what the prophets did. They kept the hope of God alive when everything else seemed lost. They spoke light into the dark. They sang songs of promise into a land of despair. They reminded a weary people that heaven was not done descending. Turn a few pages forward in Isaiah to Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. And it reads as such. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Did you catch it? There at the beginning, for to us a child is born. That's personal. That's intimate. That's heaven stooping down and saying, this promise is for you. Isaiah didn't describe a faraway God. He described a God who enters the story. A God who puts on flesh and steps into the mess. A God who would be both human and holy, the mighty God and the Prince of Peace. Now think about this. At the time Isaiah wrote those words, Jesus would not be born for another 700 years. 700 years. That's a long time to wait. And let's be honest, some of us can't wait 7 minutes for fresh popcorn without losing faith, right? But for 7 centuries, generation after generation clung to that promise. Through captivity, through return, through silence, they held on to hope that one day God would come down again. And when you turn from Isaiah to Micah 5:2, that promise narrows. And it reads, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." Micah says, Bethlehem, you're small, you're overlooked, but from you will come the one, and we know his name, Jesus. It's amazing how God works through the small and simple, isn't it? The garden, just a small patch of earth. The tent, just a piece of fabric in the wilderness. The temple, just a house of stone and gold. And now a baby, heaven wrapped in humanity, God's glory wrapped in swaddling clothes, the infinite contained in an infant. But before we get there, I want to pause and ask this. Why the prophets? Because why did God choose to speak through them? Because the prophets were not fortune tellers, they were truth tellers. They didn't exist to predict, they existed to proclaim. They were the mouthpieces of heaven, speaking God's heart into human history. And through them, God revealed his plan and his passion. Hebrews 1:1-2 says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in the last days, he has spoken to us by his Son." Do you see it? From the garden to the tent to the temple to prophets to the Son, the same God, the same story, always coming closer. Through Isaiah, God said, "I will dwell with you." Through Micah, God said, "I will come to you." Through Jeremiah, God said, "I will be your God and you will be my people." Through Ezekiel, God said, "My dwelling place will be with them forever." Every prophet was a preview. Every promise was a prophecy of presence. Every word pointed toward the Word made flesh. And let me tell you something about promises. Promises are powerful when they come from the right person. Because a promise is only as strong as the one who makes it. If I promise to buy you a new car, you might chuckle because you know my budget. But if the CEO of Toyota makes you that promise, suddenly it means something, right? Hey, when God makes a promise, it is not a possibility, it is a certainty. He doesn't try to keep his word. His word keeps itself. Isaiah said, "The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." God's passion guarantees his promise. But here's the tension. The people didn't see it yet. They only heard it. And sometimes that's where faith lives, right? Between hearing and seeing. Faith is trusting that the promise of God is true even when the proof has not appeared. That's what sustained Israel through exile. That's what sustains us through uncertainty. Church, maybe that's where you are today. You've heard God's promises, but you haven't seen them yet. You've read his word, but you're still waiting for his work. Don't lose heart. If God could keep his promise through centuries of silence, he can keep his promise to you through the waiting of a single season. Because every prophecy has a due date. And when the time was right, when the silence was full, when heaven could hold back no longer, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's Emmanuel. That's heaven came down. I love how God uses the prophets to keep hope alive in hopeless places. Isaiah's words weren't just poetic, they were pastoral. They were medicine for a broken people. They were God saying, "I haven't forgotten you, I'm still writing your story." Maybe that's what someone here today needs to hear. That your story isn't over. That your God is still speaking into your situation, that his silence is not his absence. When the prophets spoke of Emmanuel, they were describing something bigger than an event. They were describing a person. God's presence wasn't going to come in a cloud or flame anymore. It was going to come in the form of a child born not in a palace, but in poverty, not surrounded by priests, but by shepherds, not in Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem. Why? Because that's where the promise was always meant to land, in humility. God could have chosen to make his entrance on the steps of the temple, but instead he showed up in a stable. That's like the King of England being born in a barn behind a Buc-ee's. That's the upside down beauty of God. His glory always finds the low places. That's what the prophets saw. They saw the high God coming low. They saw heaven kneeling down to touch the earth. They saw the name Emmanuel. You know, the name Emmanuel, God with us, is used only 3 times in the Old Testament and once in the New. In Matthew 1:23, where the angel quotes Isaiah. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Matthew's gospel begins with God with us and ends with Jesus saying, "Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." That's the entire gospel in one thread. Because the gospel is not, cannot, should not be reduced to just the idea of separation, but is bursting full with the promise of reunification. The gospel is more than we sin, Jesus died, we are forgiven. That is how the gospel works, but it is not the gospel in its entirety. That is but one chapter of the good news. The entire book looks like this. Jesus did whatever he had to do to build an intimate and lasting relationship with humanity. He came, he suffered, he died, he rose again. Yes, yes, yes. But the gospel doesn't end just outside the empty tomb, does it? It finds completion in Revelation with the new heaven and the new earth. It is God living in and amongst us. It is a return of those close, intimate walks in the cool of the day. It is God with us. This is not a past tense faith we carry. The gospel has been, currently is, and is yet to come. Always. We have what we remember and what we look toward. And in that, we are not so different from the prophets. Because you see, the prophets didn't just announce Emmanuel, they looked forward to what we look back on. They ached for what we now experience. And sometimes I wonder, do we still ache for his presence like they did? Or have we grown accustomed to God's nearness, so much so that we forget how miraculous it really is? Because God with us is not ordinary. It's outrageous. It's unthinkable. It's divine love wearing human skin. One scholar put it like this: in every other religion, man climbs toward heaven. In Christianity, heaven climbs down toward man. That's the difference. That's the gospel. That is Immanuel. So what do we learn from the prophets? We learn that God's promises are sure. We learn that God's timing is perfect. And we learn that God's presence is coming, always coming toward his people. The prophets spoke of a God who wasn't content to be far away. They painted portraits of the coming of Christ long before Mary ever sang her song. They saw glimmers of glory breaking through the darkness. And those glimmers still shine today. Maybe your world feels dark. Maybe your hope feels distant. Maybe you've been praying and waiting and wondering if God will show up. Hear those words of the prophets. He will, He has, He is. Immanuel, God with us, is not just a Christmas name. It's the eternal nature of our God. He's with you in the garden of joy. He's with you in the wilderness of struggle. He's with you in the silence of waiting, and He's coming again to dwell forever with His people. So let's close with these words from Isaiah 9, verse 2. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. The light has dawned. The promise is alive. The prophecy is fulfilled. And is still being fulfilled in every heart that opens to Him. From the garden to the tent, from the tent to the temple, from the temple to the prophets, and from the prophets to the promise of Emmanuel, God keeps coming closer. Heaven keeps coming down, and in Jesus Christ, the final word has been spoken. I am with you. Amen, brother. So this week as we draw nearer to Christmas, remember this truth. You do not walk alone. You do not wait alone. You do not weep alone. The God of Isaiah and Micah is still Emmanuel, still God with us, still heaven come down. And next week we'll step closer still to the manger, to the moment, to the miracle. When the promise took on a name and the Word became flesh. So here are your 3 questions. I've got another question for you. How's the Christmas shopping going? How are all your preparations coming for the festivities? As you have been out and about this Christmas season, have you witnessed the souls around you? Or, and I have been guilty of this, have you seen cart pushers getting in your way? Have you seen more cars on the road just slowing you down? Maybe try this. Before you enter into the fray of holiday shopping next time, begin with this simple prayer. Maybe something like this. Lord, give me eyes to see the souls around me and opportunities to speak life into others. Be blessed and be a blessing to others.